Hello and welcome to Now More Questions, the interview series on European affairs that gets conversation started. And to get our second season started, in this episode we discuss critical raw materials in the context of an upcoming European Commission proposal for a Critical Raw Materials Act. As civilization has evolved from agriculture to industry to services and is increasingly moving towards a highly digitalized and, dare I say it, dematerialized world, our senses have gradually lost touch with the importance of materials. When we hold our handheld devices and our eyes get sucked into the endless world of viral videos and data-powered advertising, we tend to forget about the battery, the touchscreen, the display, the microphone, the electronics, or even the case. And we are far from thinking about the lithium, the nickel, the indium tin oxide, or the rare earth elements, to name but a few, required to make it all function. And that's just one example that we can all relate to. But critical raw materials are critical because they are enablers of technology. They are enablers of economic growth. And therefore, he who holds the material holds the power. So what is the plan? How will Europe power through its digital agenda, its energy transition, and the electrification of its mobility? Will it require looking into its natural resources? Will it require digging into its waste streams to exploit materials through recycling? Or will it require entering the world stage through global partnerships to secure supply? Well, to discuss these issues and more, I am joined by Rolf Kuby, Director General of Euromines. Mining is a sector that will surely be highly relevant to any initiative on critical raw materials. So Rolf, thank you for taking the time to be with us and welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you, Jean-Paul, for inviting me, and I'm happy to contribute to the discussion, and please raise your questions.
Thanks a lot, Rolf. So before we get going, could you maybe give us a short intro, the lowdown on what Euromines actually represents?
Euromines is the voice of the European mining industry, meaning the industry that is mining and exploring inside of the EU and EFTA, so Europe in a narrowed sense, linked to the European institutions. And we represent 35 members coming from companies, national federations, and commodity associations. So it's a broad portfolio of companies that are engaged in industrial minerals, metal ores, and all of the critical raw materials that you just named in your introduction.
Brilliant. So highly relevant indeed. And before we get going with this interview, it's our tradition in Now More Questions to hand over the first question to our previous guest on the show. That was Ilias Contias, Executive Director of the European Magazine Media Association and the European Newspaper Publishers Association. And he was interviewed on the topic of media freedom.
My question is linked to the issue of job creation and competitiveness, because Europe has been struggling on those two areas for a very long time, and I would certainly like to understand to what extent any regulatory intervention that will touch on the issue of raw materials that, of course, no doubt are fundamental for the European economy. What does it intend to do in terms of facilitating the competitiveness of the European economy and job creation?
And I think it's a very, very valid question to link job creation, wealth, to the mining sector. And the mining sector has been neglected over many decades, and it was easy to supply commodities for all of our value chains from outside of Europe. And so we relied on the world to provide the iron ore, the copper, the gold, the silver, and all of the very critical raw materials that you named before. And this was an easy fit we were producing the more downstream cars, high tech, and we were relying on the rest of the world. So that's the situation we are in, and now we are solicited, we are requested, we are demanded from a geopolitical perspective, looking at the war, from a transformation perspective. So we want to change our society from fuels in energy to infrastructure, and all that infrastructure, be it the windmill that you see behind us, is indispensable to have raw materials. So, and with all of the development in the sector, there will be for sure an economic development, and there will be a development on the skills. And it's a huge challenge, because we have the demographical development. We have young people who might not consider mining as being an opportune sector to work in. And I admit it might not look attractive from the first sight. But if you go to Kiruna, for example, to the LKB site in northern Sweden, it's all remote controlled activities. So the skills that you need today are young people who are able to run with remote controls devices. So it's more a gamer that you need today to run a mining operation than the old miner with a face full of dirt that is going down in the mine and trying to get the ore out of the mine. So the skills have completely changed. It's a huge challenge to find those people, to attract those people, to promote our sector as being a decent, well-paid, and also well-equipped, and from a health and safety and economic individual prosperity sector. So I can only encourage people to look into it and to discover it, and I can guarantee them that they will be fascinated by our sector. It has completely changed from what is in our heads and what our grandfathers did in the past.
So you talk about a sector that has evolved a lot from some of the images that we might have in our minds when thinking about mining. And mining will be an important aspect of this critical raw materials initiative. Just maybe to understand the context here, why is the European Commission coming up with a proposal on this now? Are we part of a policy framework that gets regularly updated, and therefore it's perfectly natural for your sector to be talking about this? Or is there a sense of urgency around this Critical Raw Materials Act that is possibly new?
There is a sense of urgency, and unfortunately, it's getting even more critical, because it's something that needs to be designed. The framework for the mining sector is something that needs to be designed for the next 10, 15, 20, and for a long time future. So the solutions, there is no quick fix to the challenges that we have. And I probably don't need to expand, and Jean-Paul, you mentioned it earlier, that we need all of those raw materials linked to the chips that run the technologies. We need the rare earths to have permanent magnets. Otherwise, we don't have a motor in an e-vehicle, and we don't have a motor in a wind turbine. So all the technologies that we have today are heavily linked to the critical raw materials, and we need to secure access to them. And we've seen how critical it was now with the gas crisis and the Russian war, that we are depending on raw materials, be it gas in the past and in the future. And today, we need those critical raw materials, and we need rare earths to be able to design and produce those products. So it's vital for the society to change, to address the issues, and that has reached the top of the Commission. Ursula von der Leyen, from the beginning of her mandate, has been talking about raw materials. Her speeches in Versailles have already indicated the way on the Critical Raw Materials Act. We are expecting it to be delivered by the Commission on the 8th of March. So it's now happening, and we are really grateful for the Commission to pick the topics up that we have been addressing to them, which are obvious, because we need to set a framework that will allow better understanding what we can do on our own. it will not be only mining. We need to rely on the rest of the world for raw materials for a long time, that's for sure, and for a couple of commodities. And we want to see more recycling to happen. But unfortunately, our urban stock is not providing the lithium that we need for all the batteries and the e-vehicles. So today, we still need a transition so that recycling can really kick in. And the KU Leuven has just released a study which indicates that up to 2040, for the energy transition, 70% of the raw materials need to come from primary sources. So that would be from the rest of the world or from mining in Europe. And since we are front runners in mining technologies and in environmental standards and in ESG, why don't we do it here? If we can do it ourselves, we have autonomy, we have resilience, we have the skills, we have the experience in Europe. We can profit from the benefits of the economic development of the sector. So why don't we take care ourselves, which I think is something that we need to discuss in society. And I trust in society and in politics that they will take the right decisions to do it ourselves also for a part of what is needed.
So excavation and mining will be a very important part of this access to critical raw materials. You mentioned this 70% figure. This may happen in Europe. It may also happen outside of Europe. But when it comes to Europe, it seems that mining is a bit of a thing of the past, I would say, in the imagery, in popular imagery. And at the same time, there might be two recent images that are quite striking and quite different in many ways. On the one hand, we saw recently the protests in Germany against the expansion of a coal mine. That was one set of images. And at the same time, there was this very optimistic announcement of the discovery of Europe's biggest deposit of rare earth metals in Sweden, which would then require mining. So what do you think about mining in Europe? Is it a thing? Is it something that people will accept? Or is it something they have happily exported elsewhere in the world?
There's a bit of both, and that's why there needs to be information, transparency on what is happening in the sector. Referring to coal mining or energy minerals mining, there is a license to operate till there is a transition in society. So the coal mining in Europe, there is a deadline till when it will happen. I think in Germany it's 2030 to then lignite mining will happen. And I think due to the economics energy crisis that we have, there is an agreement on that. So that's one part. Now, we as Euromines, we represent the non-energetic minerals and ores. So we are not that concerned about the topic of the fading out of a sector. We are in the part of the future. I can guarantee you that the mining operations that we are referring to on rare earth discovery in North Kiruna, in northern Sweden, in Kiruna, that is something that will prevail because that rare earths are needed for all of the technologies. So that's a sector that is to be there in 2050 when the transition is done. I think you have a license to lobby and to operate when you are there in the future. We with our industry, we are part of the future. So and the dialogue needs to be done so because we are at a critical moment where we can say we either do it ourselves and then we have a chance to steer the development, or we are going to go from one dependency in the past, the gas, and in the future, the rare earth that will come from China with all of the critical things that, or all the political environment that we are criticizing. So we need to take care of ourselves. We need to meet the ambition of the society, and that is taking responsibility. And that means also that we need to be honest in the society about what we want. We can't say we want mobile phones, we want clean mobility, and we don't care about where the raw materials come from. So we have a responsibility on the sourcing, the due diligence on where we source. Is there child labor in my phone, or is it a fair phone? Is there child labor in my Tesla or in my e-vehicle? So I think we need to be very honest in society and transparent on what is happening. And we need to do more, that's for sure. We need to do more also in Europe. We need to define what is responsible mining. We need to find ways to design standards around the extraction, the processing, and the recycling, because it's a responsibility along the value chain. So it's not only about mining. So the clean technologies start in the mine, but there is a responsibility for each and every step along the value chain and back from the recycling of a end of life product.
And when we hear that, that the presence of these critical raw materials tends to be outside of Europe, I think there are some figures around China having more than 90% of some of the critical raw materials that we are really interested in. Is that something related to geology, or is it something rather related to mining capacity, mining culture, even investment in mining? Would you say it's rather linked to Europe having underinvested and neglected its own mining capacity, or is it more a simple question of geology?
It's about neglecting, and it's about economic development, and it's about China being a very aggressive industry partner in the world's economy. So the rare earths are not that rare in the earth crush. So that is obvious that it's a question about identifying where there are rare earths, like you heard the potential that is in northern Sweden. And now we need to mine it, and now we need to process it. So it's also about the processing. It's not only about digging it out, it's also about how to concentrate the mineral and the metals, so that you have something that you can build your cathode material or your permanent magnet. So it's about the technologies around it, and it's energy intensive, and it's also intensive in its industrial activity, and that's why it has been outsourced to China, and China has been a very aggressive player. If you look at the magnesium metal case, they have been dumping the magnesium metal for many years, so that all of the EU production more or less closed 10 years ago. So we are depending 100% on the magnesium metal from China, and then when they think they don't have enough of it for themselves, so they simply just close a valve, and we are cut off of that source, which all the consequences to the aluminium and the steel refiners in Europe. So that also highlighted, and that was before the war, that China is not a fair player in economic terms. We can't rely on our multilateralism and the ruling of the WTO. We need to secure our access to raw materials. We need to push for sustainability and due diligence in the value chains, and that's clearly indicating the way towards European mining, because here we know what we are doing. We are doing it ourselves. We know at what level of environmental, social, and economic ambition we are doing that. But we need to also be then protected from unfair players outside of the world, so that the economic activities here and the business model here in Europe, the business plan, can work.
And there are two dimensions, it seems. On the one hand, there is the process itself, the mining process, the potential environmental impacts of that process that may or may not be greater in some parts of the world compared to what is done in Europe. But the fact that this mining aspect has hardly been considered, or at least not raised very strongly in the political ambitions that are linked to decarbonization or electrification or digitalization, it seems as if it's almost a forgotten sector. And I'm just wondering, is it also forgotten in terms of its environmental impact when considering some of the transitions we're talking about? I mean, has that impact sufficiently been taken into account? And overall, if we need to mine more certain things, will that not have a greater impact in the end? And maybe we are underestimating it.
Yeah, mining has an impact. But it's all linked to the environmental laws and environmental impact assessment. That's why today permitting is a very, very long process from the start of the discovery to the final realization. Also, the project that we were referring to, the rare earth, is something which is going to deliver in 10 to 15 years. So that's a misfortune, but that also stresses the urgency that we need to act now. Now, compared to the rest of the world, I can guarantee you that we are on an environmental ambition far ahead of the rest of the world with what we are doing in Europe, and for social and for economic development reasons. It is also obvious that Europe is a front runner in the social and economic environmental concerns. So I see only good elements here. Now, we have neglected that in the past because it was so easy to go to the border and to get access to commodities. And the political ambition is now to go for more raw materials from European bases, be it recycling or be it primary sources. And we are starting, and we are seeing in France and national laws being developed around the topic of raw materials. But for sure, it is only one part. And it can only complement what we need to have with strong raw material partnerships with Canada. EU, Namibia is also building on that. We need to increase our links to good friends, which is Norway. We need fast in EU raw material partnership with Norway. And so we need to rely on a positive thinking Western world that is based on the values that we have, our rules of law, and then we can build jointly a future work. And if emissions and impact is in Europe or in the rest of the world, it doesn't matter, for example, for climate change. I think we need to guarantee that we all have the same ambitions all over the world. And with the international companies that are part of our Euromines membership, we can guarantee that for those that I know and I understand and I see what they do, I can guarantee you that they have similar ambitions as I have described.
And so maybe if Europe was a little bit more sovereign with its raw materials, it might also ease tensions around the world, because probably some of the tensions that we see between the United States, Europe, Russia, China can also probably be explained by this access and supply of raw materials. I would well imagine. And maybe your reading could be interesting, but I would like to push a little bit further then on the recycling aspect, because you mentioned this 70% of mining, but even if a lot of this will depend on mining, we still need to already think about what kind of products and end applications will come out of all of this, and what will happen to these materials once they have been used. Because even if we're talking about 10, 20 or 30 years of use in final products, we don't want to see scenes like we sometimes see in deserts or what have you, where you see dumps of computer hardware and things like that. What kind of reflections are existing in terms of the recycling of end applications linked to the excavation of these raw materials today or in the near future?
The best example is the EU battery directive. That is linked to e-mobility and the design of batteries. And it's called eco-design in a very short. It's design for recycling. So you need to work from the start if you want to design a product that is going to be fit for recycling and it's going to be efficient in its use phase. So that's happening already today. It's very complex. It needs to include elements on due diligence, and it needs to include life cycle assessment of a product. So I think this is in the making, and it's not an easy task, and it's now the batteries, and it will need to be extended to all products at the end of the day. Because if you mine something, then you need to take care. That means you need to explain how to use a mineral or and how it's going to be handled in the product phase, be it through REACH chemical legislation, and then it needs to be also regulated in a way how it's going to be recycled, because we don't want to lose anything that is possibly recycled at the end of the life of a product.
Yeah, I think that kind of thinking needs to be integrated, because we see too often, in these big transitions, we tend to not completely understand the final transformation of society, everything that can come out of all of this. And there is a little bit of a worry that we change one bad for another bad later in the future. Some design thinking at an early stage is definitely important. So we're getting to the end of this interview. I would just like then to have you reflect on what will be upcoming. So this Critical Raw Materials Act, what are your expectations exactly then from the European Commission? And do you think this will be a game changer for your sector?
I think it will be a game changer for our sector, although the discussion is ongoing. Yeah? So the Critical Raw Materials Act will be only one more piece to the discussion. It will be a game changer because it has drawn a lot of attention to our sector, and it has underlined that raw materials are indispensable for modern society and for the society of the future, and that we need to find those raw materials and secure those raw materials. Now, what we would like to see, and we have indications that the issue is being tackled in the Critical Raw Materials Act, is around the permitting. How can we kind of find a way that we have a common understanding that permitting in mining needs to happen in an efficient way? It doesn't mean that we want to neglect any kind of environmental legislation. That's not the question. The question is, do we put enough effort on the permitting from the administrative side, from the political side, from the support, and also from the legal perspective? So, is it possible to make permitting exploration faster and more efficient, so that we can deliver and we don't fall from a 10 to 15 year perspective that the sector can deliver into a 20 to 30 years perspective? Then, because then we will fall short surely on our ambition to secure critical raw materials. And it's the same for the rest of the world. So it's not only linked to what is happening in Europe. We need also our partners to be faster to secure the immense amount of metals and industrial minerals that are needed for the society. So it is we need stronger partnerships. We need an agency or good governance on the topic of raw materials. We need an understanding in legislation that for sure we need to have a description of what is our environmental ambition, but also linked to all the revisions of legislations at EU or national level. You need to think about raw materials. You can't simply say we are only looking at environmental skills. No, raw materials need to be part of the analysis of each and every decision that the society takes. You can't build a road, you can't build a house, you can't build a windmill without thinking where are the raw materials going to come from, and what it entails. So I think it is a lot about the awareness raising, and for a part also on the legislation.
And in many ways, it's a very refreshing discussion, because when thinking about climate issues, it's all very doom and gloom, and the Earth is basically on the verge of collapse. But when we're talking about critical raw materials, we actually realize, well, hang on a minute, the Earth is actually extremely resourceful. And maybe sometimes, again, we overestimate our own human impact on the Earth, and maybe actually the Earth has a lot more resources than we think. Dare we notice them? So that's an interesting and refreshing thought. So thanks a lot, Rolf, for having taken the time to be with us and shared your insights on this upcoming act.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. Happy to talk once it's out again about it, and looking forward to the next exchange.
That was Rolf Kuby, Director General of Euromines, on the Critical Raw Materials Act. I hope you enjoyed the discussion and the start of our Season 2. Stay tuned for our next episodes.